33 AD, Perfumes and Filth, the ancient paradox, how Jerusalem tried to mask the stench. This is not the story they taught you in the scrolls. This is the story that lived in the nostrils of every man, woman and child who walked through those ancient gates, the story no one dared to speak aloud, because admitting it would mean admitting that the holiest city on earth smelled like death itself. Jerusalem in the year 33 was a city of impossible contradictions. From a distance it shimmered. The Temple Mount rose like a crown of white marble and gold, catching the Judean sun in a way that made travelers fall to their knees on the Roman roads miles before they ever reached its walls. Pilgrims wept at the sight of it. Poets compared it to a jewel resting on the hills. But those poets, it must be said, were usually writing from a safe distance, upwind, because the moment a traveler passed through one of the great gates, the illusion cracked. The smell hit first. It always hit first. A thick, layered wall of odor that was part animal blood, part human waste, part rotting vegetables and part something else entirely, something ancient and sour that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath their sandals. Jerusalem was not merely a city that had a smell. Jerusalem was a smell that happened to have a city built around it. And in the heart of this reeking maze of narrow limestone streets, in a modest workshop tucked between a tanner's yard and a butcher's stall in the lower city, there lived a man named Silas. He was not a priest. He was not a scholar. He was not a soldier of Rome or a rebel of Judea. Silas was a perfumer, and in a city that smelled the way Jerusalem smelled, a perfumer was something close to a miracle worker. Silas was 43 years old, though he looked older. His hands were permanently stained from years of grinding resins and pressing petals. His fingernails carried traces of saffron and myrrh that no amount of washing could remove. His eyes, dark brown and deeply set beneath a heavy brow, held the quiet exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting an invisible war, a war against the air itself. He had inherited the trade from his father, Matthias, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of men who had dedicated their lives to making Jerusalem bearable. Their clients ranged from wealthy Sadducee wives who wanted to smell like Egyptian royalty, to Roman officers who simply could not stomach the city they were stationed in. Silas served them all without judgment. Coin was coin, and in the weeks before Passover, coin flowed like the Kidron. Passover, that was the season that tested every fiber of Silas's craft. During normal months, Jerusalem held perhaps 40,000 souls, but as the great festival approached, that number swelled to 200,000, sometimes more. Pilgrims poured in from every corner of the known world, from Alexandria, from Babylon, from Antioch, from Rome itself. They came with their families, their animals, their hopes and their waste. The city's already overwhelmed infrastructure buckled under the weight. The narrow streets became rivers of humanity, and beneath the feet of that humanity, other rivers flowed, ones that no psalm could sanctify. The drainage system, such as it was, had been designed for a fraction of the population it now served. Open channels carved into the stone streets were meant to carry rainwater and minor refuse downhill toward the Kidron Valley. But during Passover, these channels carried far worse. Animal entrails from the thousands of lambs slaughtered at the temple washed through the streets in dark, sluggish streams. Human waste from overtaxed latrines seeped into corners and alleyways where children played and merchants sold bread. The Great Kidron itself became so polluted during the festival weeks that locals called it the Blood Brook, and the stench from its banks could make a grown man gag from a quarter-mile away. And then there was the temple itself. The holiest site in the Jewish world was also, during Passover, its largest slaughterhouse. Tens of thousands of lambs were brought through the gates over the course of a single week. The priests worked in shifts, their white garments soaked red by midday. The blood was drained through channels built into the altar's base, flowing down through carved stone gutters into collection pools and eventually into the Kidron. The fat was burned on the altar, sending columns of greasy black smoke into the sky that mingled with the incense and created a haze that hung over the mount like a second ceiling. Silas had witnessed 30 Passovers in his lifetime, and each one seemed worse than the last. This year, as he prepared his workshop for the surge of desperate clients who would soon appear at his door, he felt a heaviness he could not name. It was more than exhaustion. It was a creeping sense that no amount of frankincense or nard could cover what was really rotting in this city, and he was not sure he meant the drains. His apprentice, a sharp-eyed boy of 16 named Jonas, arrived that morning carrying a basket of fresh spikenard roots from the market. Jonas was thin, quick, and perpetually curious, the kind of boy who asked questions that had no comfortable answers. He set the basket down and wrinkled his nose at the air drifting in from the tanner's yard next door. "Master Silas," he said, "do you ever wonder if we are doing something noble or something foolish, covering one lie with another?" Silas looked at the boy for a long moment. "Every single day," he said quietly, and then he turned back to his mortar and began to grind. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories from forgotten corners of history fascinate you, if you want to keep discovering what the textbooks never told you, then hit subscribe right now, because what happens next in Silas's story and in Jerusalem's will change everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. The first client arrived before the sun had fully cleared the Mount of Olives. She was a woman named Miriam, wife of a wealthy Pharisee named Ezra ben Tobias, and she came wrapped in linen so fine it was nearly transparent, flanked by 2 servants carrying clay jars. Miriam was perhaps 30, handsome rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth set in a permanent expression of mild displeasure, as though the world had promised her something better and had consistently failed to deliver. "Silas," she said, not as a greeting, but as a command. "I need something stronger. Last year's blend was insufficient. By the second night of the feast, my husband's dining hall smelled like a stable." Silas nodded and led her to the shelves along the back wall where he kept his most precious ingredients. Rows of sealed clay vessels, each marked with careful symbols only he and Jonas could read, lined the stone ledges. Frankincense from the Arabian Peninsula, myrrh from the coast of East Africa, cinnamon bark from the traders who traveled the spice roads east of Persia, spikenard from the high valleys beyond the Jordan, balsam from the groves of En-Gedi, the most expensive perfume ingredient in the known world, worth more by weight than gold. "Tell me about the room," Silas said. "How many guests? How large is the space? How much ventilation from the courtyard?" Miriam described her husband's triclinium in detail, a large dining room designed in the Roman fashion with reclining couches arranged around a central table. It seated 30. The courtyard was enclosed. Ventilation was poor. Her husband insisted on roasting 2 whole lambs indoors during the festival dinner. She said this last part with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had lost this argument many times before. Silas calculated in his head he would need a layered approach, a heavy base of frankincense resin to burn continuously in braziers throughout the evening, providing a constant foundation of scent, a middle layer of myrrh-infused oil to anoint the guests as they arrived, which would create a cloud of fragrance that moved with the people themselves. And a finishing touch, a sprinkling of powdered spikenard mixed with rose petals on the floor, so that as sandaled feet moved across the stone, they would release fresh bursts of scent with every step. "This will not be inexpensive," he warned. Miriam waved a hand, as though the concept of expense was something that happened to other people. "My husband dines with a member of the Sanhedrin this Passover," she said. The cost of smelling like a tanner would be far greater. After Miriam left, the clients came in a steady stream. A Roman centurion named Gaius, who had been stationed in Jerusalem for 2 years and still could not acclimate to the smell during festival season. A group of Greek-speaking merchants from the Decapolis who wanted scented oils for a private banquet. A young bride from a modest family who could afford only a small vial of diluted rosewater, but whose eyes held such desperate hope that Silas mixed it twice as strong and charged her half the price. Jonas noticed but said nothing. Between clients, Jonas posed the questions that had been building in his mind. "Master, where does it all go? The blood, the waste, the filth. They say the Kidron carries it away, but carries it away to where?" Silas explained what he knew. The Kidron Valley ran south and east of the city, eventually descending toward the Dead Sea. During the rainy season, the brook had enough flow to move the worst of the pollution downstream. But during Passover, which fell in the dry spring months, the flow was sluggish. The waste pooled, it stagnated, it bred flies and disease. The farms in the valley downstream used the water for irrigation, and some years the crops grew strangely, too lush in some patches, dead in others. Nobody spoke about it publicly. The priests said the temple's drainage was blessed. The Romans said the engineering was adequate. The people held perfumed cloths to their faces and kept walking. "So we are all just pretending," Jonas said. It was not a question. "Pretending is what civilizations do," Silas replied. "The Romans pretend they bring order. The priests pretend the sacrifices please God. The merchants pretend the economy is healthy. And I pretend that a handful of myrrh can make a slaughterhouse smell like a garden. Everyone plays their part." If this story is making you think about how some things never change, drop a comment right now telling me what modern paradox reminds you of ancient Jerusalem. I want to hear your thoughts. That afternoon, something unusual happened. A servant arrived at the workshop, not from one of the wealthy households, but from the temple itself. He carried a sealed letter bearing the stamp of Caiaphas, the high priest. Silas broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter was brief and direct. The high priest required Silas's services for a private matter. He was to come to the temple complex that evening after the last sacrifice. He was to tell no one. Jonas watched Silas read the letter 3 times. "What does it say?" "It says," Silas murmured, folding the papyrus carefully, "that even the holiest men in Jerusalem cannot escape the smell." Silas arrived at the temple complex as the last light bled from the sky, turning the white stone walls the color of old bone. He had been inside the outer courts many times, every Jewish man had, but he had never been summoned to the inner chambers where the priestly administration conducted its business. A guard led him through a series of corridors that smelled of stale incense and lamp oil, past rooms stacked with scrolls and accounting tablets, until they reached a heavy cedar door. Inside, the chamber was surprisingly modest. Stone walls, a single table, 2 oil lamps, and behind the table sat Caiaphas, the most powerful religious figure in Judea. He was smaller than Silas had expected. A compact man with a neatly trimmed beard going grey at the edges and eyes that moved with the calculating speed of a merchant appraising goods, except these eyes appraised souls. "You are the perfumer," Caiaphas said. Again, not a question. "I am." Caiaphas leaned back. "I have a problem, Silas. A problem that requires discretion and expertise. The drainage system beneath the temple altar is failing. It has been failing for years, but this Passover, with the political tensions and the Roman governor breathing down our necks, we cannot afford any public embarrassment. The smell from the lower channels has begun to reach the court of women. Pilgrims are complaining. Some are saying it is a sign of divine displeasure." Silas understood immediately. The smell was not merely unpleasant, it was politically dangerous. If the pilgrims believed the temple itself had become polluted, if they interpreted the stench as a sign from God, the consequences could be catastrophic. Faith was fragile. It rested on symbols, and the temple was the greatest symbol of all. A temple that smelled like a sewer was a temple that had lost its authority. "What do you need from me?" Silas asked. "I need you to make it disappear," Caiaphas said. "Not the drainage problem, I have engineers for that, though they tell me the repairs will take months. I need you to make the smell disappear for 1 week, 7 days, through the end of Passover. After that, the crowds will thin, and we will fix the channels properly." It was an enormous request. The temple complex was vast. The court of women alone could hold thousands. The amount of incense and aromatic compounds needed to mask a failing drainage system beneath tens of thousands of animal sacrifices would be staggering. "The cost," Silas began, "is irrelevant," Caiaphas interrupted. "Name your price. Take it from the temple treasury. I care only about results." Silas spent that night in his workshop, calculating. Jonas helped him draw up the quantities. They would need frankincense by the cartload, myrrh in quantities that would drain every merchant in the market, cinnamon, cassia, balsam, and spikenard. They would need to design a system of bronze braziers placed strategically throughout the courts, burning continuously, fed by teams of temple servants working in shifts. They would need to infuse the water used for ritual washing with rose and lavender extracts, so that every surface pilgrims touched would carry a pleasant scent. It was, in essence, the largest perfuming operation in the history of Jerusalem. "We are building a lie," Jonas said quietly as they worked by lamplight. "A beautiful, fragrant lie." Silas paused. He looked at his apprentice, this boy who saw too clearly for his own comfort. "Yes," he said, "but consider the alternative. If the pilgrims lose faith in the temple, what follows? Panic, unrest. The Romans would use any disturbance as an excuse to tighten their grip. People would suffer. Sometimes, Jonas, a well-crafted lie protects more lives than a careless truth." Jonas was silent for a long time. Then he said something that lodged in Silas's chest like a splinter. "Is that what the priests tell themselves about everything?" The operation began the next morning. Silas hired every available laborer in the lower city to transport the materials. Cartloads of resin and dried herbs moved through the streets at dawn before the pilgrims woke. Bronze braziers were installed in the temple courts under the cover of festival preparations. The temple servants were given strict instructions on how to maintain the burns, which compounds to use at which hours, how to adjust for wind direction. Silas personally supervised the placement of each brazier, walking the courts with his nose as his guide, mapping the invisible currents of stench and counter-scent like a general mapping a battlefield. By the first day of Passover, the temple smelled extraordinary. Pilgrims entering the court stopped in their tracks, breathing deeply, their faces softening with something that looked very much like peace. The layered fragrances of frankincense, myrrh, and balsam mingled with the natural incense of the altar sacrifices to create something almost otherworldly. Women wept. Old men closed their eyes and swayed. Children tugged at their parents' robes and asked if this was what heaven smelled like. Beneath it all, the drains still festered. The blood still pooled. The rot still spread through the ancient stone channels like a dark whisper, but nobody could smell it, nobody could see it. And so, for all practical purposes, it did not exist. Silas watched from the edge of the court of the Gentiles as thousands of pilgrims moved through the space, their faces lifted, their lungs full of sacred air. He should have felt proud. He had accomplished something remarkable. Instead, he felt hollow. On the fourth day of Passover, the system nearly failed. A shift in the wind, blowing from the south instead of the usual western breeze, pushed the rising fumes from the Kidron Valley directly into the lower courts. For one terrible hour in the early afternoon, the stench broke through the Perfume's barrier like a fist through silk. Pilgrims covered their faces, children cried. A group of Galilean visitors began shouting that the temple was cursed. Silas was summoned immediately. He ran through the streets with Jonas at his heels, carrying emergency supplies, concentrated balsam oil, and handfuls of cassia bark that could be burned quickly to produce thick, overpowering smoke. They reached the temple and worked frantically, feeding the braziers with double portions, placing additional burning pots in the lower corridors, even pouring aromatic oils directly onto the hot stones of the courtyard floor so that the heat would vaporize the scent upward in visible, fragrant clouds. Within 2 hours, the crisis was contained. The pilgrims calmed. The shouting stopped. Caiaphas sent a servant with a purse of silver and a single word of thanks. Silas took the silver and felt nothing. That evening, sitting in his workshop with the door open to the cooling night air, Silas had a conversation with Jonas that would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives. Jonas had been quiet all day, quieter than usual, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that did not belong to a boy of 16. Master Silas, I walked through the lower city today, past the pool of Siloam, down to where the Kidron bends south. The water is black, Master. Not brown, not murky. Black. And the people who live in those streets, the tanners, the dyers, the poorest families, they have no perfume. They have no frankincense to burn. They breathe the truth of this city every single day while the wealthy breathe our lies. Silas said nothing for a long time. He sat with his stained hands resting on his knees and stared at the small flame of his oil lamp. I know, he said finally. I have always known. The perfume trade is not about creating beauty, Jonas. It is about creating distance. Distance between the rich and the poor. Distance between what the city is and what the city pretends to be. Distance between reality and the story we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night. Then why do you do it? Silas smiled, and there was no joy in it. Because if I did not, someone else would, and they might not give the young bride the double-strength rosewater at half price. They might not slip a bag of lavender to the old widow on the corner who cannot afford to mask the smell of her own illness. I cannot fix the drains, Jonas. I cannot change the system. I can only make small, imperfect kindnesses within it and hope that someday someone braver than me will demand that they fix the drains instead of burning more incense. The last 3 days of Passover passed without incident. The braziers burned, the pilgrims prayed, the lambs died by the thousands, and their blood flowed through channels both seen and unseen. On the final day, Silas stood at the edge of the Temple Mount and watched the sun set over the western hills. The sky turned crimson and gold, and the smoke from the altar and the braziers rose together in a single column that looked, from the right angle, like a pillar of cloud reaching toward heaven. He thought about the city beneath his feet, the layers upon layers of stone and history, of conquests and rebuildings, of prayers and compromises. He thought about the drains that had been failing for years and would continue to fail long after this Passover was forgotten. He thought about the black water of the Kidron and the families who drank from it because they had no other choice. He thought about the frankincense and the myrrh and the spikenard, those precious substances that traveled thousands of miles across deserts and seas to end up burning in bronze bowls, converting the unbearable into the beautiful for a few hours at a time. And Silas understood, with a clarity that felt like both a wound and a gift, that this was the oldest human story of all. Not the story of faith or empire, not the story of war or peace, but the story of the mask. The endless, exhausting, creative, desperate human effort to cover what we cannot bear to face. Jerusalem in 33 AD was not unique. It was simply honest about what every civilization since has tried to hide. The perfume fades. It always fades. And when it does, what remains is the question that Jonas asked in a lamplit workshop on a spring night 2,000 years ago. A question that still has no answer. Are we building something real? Or are we just making the lie smell better? If you watched all the way to this point, it is because this story touched something real in you. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end," so I can meet you and know who truly values the stories on this channel. If this narrative made you think, hit the like button and share it with someone who appreciates history that feels alive. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the moment, because stories like this one, stories that dig beneath the surface of history to find the human truth buried underneath, that is exactly what this channel is about. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you in the next one.